Yeah, when I think of limiting beliefs, like one way to think about it is, and the reason they can hold churches back from growing and multiplying is because, in some sense, like you don't give God the chance to show up because you don't step out and take a risk because of some limiting belief. You know, the thing that we talk about a lot here at Mercy Hill is this idea of preparing the jars from 2 Kings 4, and it's a story of, this lady's husband dies. She goes to the prophet. She basically says, like, what am I going to do? We're poor, all this stuff. And basically a miracle happens, but God uses the woman's faith in the miracle. And we actually see this throughout the Bible where, Jesus is like, man, does anybody have any food, right? And you got the fish and the loaves. Like, there's so many examples of God wanting us to step up and see where our faith is. So in that 2 Kings 4 story, basically God filled the amount of jars that she went and got. A lot of times the things with limiting beliefs, like most people are not going to say these out loud.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's the internal kind of dialogue that's going on in their head. Yeah.
Exactly. And as pastors, a lot of times what we're going to do is there's for each of these, we're probably going to figure out a way to kind of spiritualize the issue, spiritualize the limiting belief in a way that takes us off the hook.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby, and I have Pastor Jonathan Yarborough with us today, and we have a really good episode in store today. We've done similar episodes like this in the past, but I think it's really important to always be revisiting this stuff because what we're going to address today is something that we all deal with. And I would also say it's kind of a tension to be managed, meaning we're always going to deal with this when it comes to leadership, when it comes to vision, when it comes to taking the next hill. And so what we're going to be talking about today is, Breaking Barriers is all about helping churches grow so that they can go, right? Yep. If a church is growing, then they're able to multiply. It's very hard to send and multiply if a church is not growing. And so today what we're going to talk about is kind of some of those things that end up getting in the way of churches growing and multiplying. And a lot of times it's just limiting beliefs or frameworks or, just stuff that people need to let go of to be able to grow as a church. Because a lot of times, and, we all deal with this, but a lot of times the stuff that's holding us back as pastors and leaders and vision casters, a lot of times the stuff that's holding us back is ourselves. And 100%. It's the deep-rooted limiting beliefs that we have sometimes. And the way that I would define a limiting belief is, it's basically just like a thought, a framework, a belief that we believe to be kind of absolute, but it's not necessarily absolute. And we have kind of framed our thinking in a way that ends up holding ourselves back, right? Something really simple in life. We say, hey, this would be really good for you. And we say, well, I don't have time for that, right? Sometimes that is just like a way that we frame something that kind of just gets us off the hook from having to be kind of responsible for that specific thing. And in ministry, it's so easy to have all these different limiting beliefs. And a lot of times I would even say, and maybe I would love to get your thoughts on this, because ministry is spiritual, rightfully so, right? And we're going after kingdom things, and it's not all on us.
Right.
Like, God's doing the work. Like, we can't do anything without God, the Spirit kind of blowing on it.
That's right.
Well, because of that, a lot of times, I think in ministry, we can have more limiting beliefs than other areas of life or business or whatever, because it's easy to kind of hide behind the spiritual things, like if things aren't going the way we want them to go, or, maybe we're not really living up to our potential as a leader.
We sort of just blame that on God.
Yeah.
The Spirit isn't moving, or, we're doing the things that we're supposed to do, but, we can kind of hide behind, well, God just hasn't breathed on that yet in His sovereignty and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Now, obviously, there is a there is truth to that, right? Like, man, we sow the seed, like we water the seed, but like God has to give it growth.
Right.
So there's an absolute, undeniable.
You can do all the right things.
Correct.
And God still may not breathe on the thing. So that's certainly part of all this that we can't deny.
But the fact that being a ministry leader, there is this spiritual realm.
Yeah.
It's very easy to just hide behind, man, we did our best. God didn't do it. It is what it is. And what happens is that can keep us from kind of viewing things correctly.
Right.
We kind of end up viewing things with kind of this real shaded, really these kind of limiting beliefs. And so today specifically, I'm gonna let Pastor Jonathan lead. We want to bring up some of these limiting beliefs that keep churches specifically from growing and multiplying. Just in our experience that we have dealt with ourselves, and we've heard other pastors that we coach and mentor deal with some of these limiting beliefs.
I mean, you do a lot of coaching, like in the running world and all that kind of stuff too, outside of this. And I've been kind of on some of this fitness journeys myself, and one of the things that I have found is that there were a lot of things that I was holding on to. I mean, people would say like I'm a gym rat and all that. Learned all this stuff by like watching videos and reading articles and all this kind of stuff. And I would go just kind of try things out, make it with a whole lot of incorrect beliefs that led me to doing things like overtraining and totally fatiguing my body and all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I got somebody to step in and say, no, you're thinking about these things incorrectly and making these adjustments, to where I started to see some kind of progress. Even when it came to the diet, I was eating what I thought were the right kinds of things, and it turns out I was eating all of the wrong kinds of things that weren't leading to the right kind of changes. So
yeah, when I think of limiting beliefs, like one way to think about it is, and the reason they can hold churches back from growing and multiplying is because, in some sense, like you don't give God the chance to show up. Because you don't step out and take a risk because of some limiting belief. The thing that we talk about a lot here at Mercy Hill is this idea of preparing the jars from 2 Kings 4. And it's a story of, this lady's husband dies. She goes to the prophet. She basically says, like, what am I going to do? We're poor, like, all this stuff. And basically a miracle happens, but God uses the woman's faith in the miracle. And we actually see this throughout the Bible where Jesus is like, man, does anybody have any food, right? And you got the fish and the loaves. Like, there's so many examples of God wanting us to step up and see where our faith is. So in that 2 Kings 4 story, basically God filled the amount of jars that she went and got.
If she had brought 5 jars, it would have been a completely different story than the way she went out to the neighbors, risking so much with her reputation and then thinking she was some kind of idiot and all this kind of stuff, going out and collecting this massive amount of jars. God fills up the jars, but it leaves you wondering, what if she had had a limiting belief around that, and she had just thought incorrectly that God could only do 5 jars?
Right. And that's what we're talking about today. And a lot of times the things with limiting beliefs, like most people are not going to say these out loud.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's the internal kind of dialogue that's going on in their head. Yeah.
Exactly. And as pastors, a lot of times what we're going to do is there's for each of these, we're probably going to figure out a way to kind of spiritualize the issue, spiritualize the limiting belief in a way that takes us off the hook. So let's walk through some of these.
I think it'd be helpful if, as we walk through them, let's kind of talk about what you just said of what are some of the ways people would spiritualize some of these kinds of limiting beliefs. All right. So we're going to look through 5 of these things, 5 of these things that people need to let go of if they want to see their churches grow and multiply. So the first one is this desire for certainty. You know how a lot of times what we end up thinking, and we start saying things like, gosh, I don't want to take this step yet because I don't know that there's a lot of clarity around what it's supposed to look like. And so that kind of lack of clarity keeps people from taking a step, keeps them from making a decision. They get immobilized, paralyzed by this lack of clarity, when in actuality, what they're longing for is certainty. They want to know what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, and most importantly, that it's going to work on the other side. And so not knowing whether or not it's going to work will keep people from making the decisions they need to make to be able to see the churches grow, to see their church multiply. The first time that a church takes a step to see something multiply like that, it can be really, really scary. And not knowing what's on the other side of that can keep them from making that kind of decision.
Yeah, totally. One of the ways that I see this play out is, I think with younger churches, a lot of times there's not a lot of certainty, like when a church is just starting, and you wonder why. You've heard the statistics about how church plants and brand new churches reach more people based on the amount of people they have in their church than like a larger church or just a more established church.
Yep.
Because I do think one of the things that happens as a church gets older and ages is once there's more stuff and there's more stuff you could potentially lose or there's more stuff that can go wrong, it's like you want more certainty, than God's ever going to give you when it comes to his mission. When a church was young, it was just like, man, we're going to do our best, but there's no certainty here. Like we're going to try our best. Man, this thing's starting from nothing, like we are, man, new movement, new area, starting from nothing. But once a church is really established, it's like we kind of move away from that.
Yep.
And it's like the only bets we're willing to take are like this fail-safe, can't lose.
That's right.
Can't mess up. And I don't really know. I mean, there's probably a lot of things on a really deep level that are behind that. I mean, one of the things I think, as a pastor begins to, do ministry vocationally, and now their income is dependent on that. And, there's these accountability structures and not wanting to fail and not wanting to look foolish in front of the church, in front of the elders. Like
there's just so much to lose.
There's a lot of deep stuff going on.
Yeah. And
we got to press beyond that because it's not that we just want to go out and be reckless, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, there's certainty like ultimately with God's mission, right?
Right.
But there's not any certainty with any specific thing that you're going to go and do. But you're going to for the church to grow, you're going to have to be willing to step out in times that are uncertain and making decisions where you don't know what the outcome's going to be.
Hey, so let's go to a time that was completely uncertain. I mean, I don't want to cause any triggers here or anything when I say the word, but the COVID era.
Right.
I mean, nobody had any idea what to do when all of that happened. No church had ever faced anything like that before. There was no manual. Nobody learned in seminary. Hey, when a worldwide pandemic breaks out, these are the things you're supposed to do. When the government comes in and says you can't meet anymore, this is what you're supposed to do. There was nothing like that. And so it seemed like, every week, every couple of weeks, we were getting together and trying to make decisions about what was going to be the best thing to keep the church moving forward. But all of it was a guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, some churches went this way on these issues and some churches went this way on these issues. And it would lead to all kinds of repercussions that would happen. Sometimes whatever decision they would make would help them get ahead. And then sometimes they'd make a decision that would just be that would really harm the church. But you didn't know which one was. It was just like one decision after another decision based on, you were just guessing. I think Ryan Britt at 1122, he talks a lot about, hey, we're going to pray, we're going to guess, and then we're going to go. Mm-hmm. And so it was a lot of that kind of stuff during the COVID time.
Yeah, I would guess that some ministry leaders just need to be freed from needing certainty.
Yeah.
Because I mean, none of us started ministry with certainty, like knowing what God was going to do or knowing what the outcome was going to be. But for whatever reason, over time, maybe as we just get older, we want more and more certainty. But that's not how the mission of God goes forward. It's not on the backs of people that are super certain about what, it's on the backs of people that are willing to take a risk and willing to go for it, not knowing what the outcome is.
I mean, in the end, it's trusting God, right? I mean, I was just talking to a guy a couple weeks ago that was saying, hey, I'm willing to believe the things within the Christian faith that you can prove are true. I'm like, Well, that's not faith, man.
Right.
I mean, faith is when you don't know exactly what it is, and you say, I'm going to believe that.
Right, right. So the second one, the second thing that people need to let go of to see their church grow and multiply is really kind of just letting go of the status quo. Because here's the reality. The majority of people, I say the majority because not everybody, but a lot of people do not like change, including pastors, including ministry leaders. And to grow, like if you're going to grow and your church is going to grow, you are guaranteeing that there's going to be a lot of change.
Yeah.
And people are going to get ruffled. You're going to get ruffled. And some people are just not willing to let go of the status quo.
I mean, on a personal level, right? I would say I enjoy causing change. Mm-hmm. But when change happens to me, I mean, that's a different story, you know? And so it's like, I don't have a problem being the person that's initiating change within some sort of organizational system. I enjoy that kind of thing. But when someone else is changing something that is shaking up my world, you know, I feel that just like anybody else. And so we all have this propensity to kind of want to hold on to what is familiar. And when we hold on to what is familiar and keep everything the same, I mean, that's what results in something that we call plateau. Mm-hmm. You know, that's where when churches kind of flatline and they're not going up or they're going down, everything's just staying the same. That's not what we're after. Mm-hmm. You know, the kingdom we're supposed to advance the kingdom, and that means grow it.
Yep. Yeah, so like I think about, you know, Pastor Andrew, we'll talk about this a lot, and I really admire him for this because he, based on personality, you know, like with the Strengths Finder and stuff, he has context in the top 5, and so
right.
He's very much wired like, man, like if it ain't broke, if it's seemingly like, man, let's just leave the thing alone. Like let's not continue to kind of, you know, change stuff, and like I like it how it was, you know.
Where you and I go, man, it's working great. Let's try this and see if it might work too.
Right. Yeah. But I really admire, you know, Pastor Andrew because like he's willing to step outside of the comfort zone because he can see that, hey, like, man, sometimes even when things are going good, like to get better, they're going to have to change.
That's right.
And, you know, just to be able to, as a ministry leader, to just say, hey, yeah, I like the way it is, but like, man, we're trying to get better. Like we're trying to push forward. The things we're trying to go after are spiritual, you know, really, really important things. I would say too, in the church, there's going to be a bunch of people that are super supportive when you're going after and going for the mission. And then there's going to be people that get really upset just because purely it's change happening to them. They got to sit somewhere else. They got to go to a new service time. Like people just like to do the same things over and over and over and over.
Yeah. I mean, all of us have our own routines in life. I mean, even when it comes down to like the songs that you listen to when you're driving down the road, or a particular podcast that you're listening to, like Breaking Barriers while you're going down the road, something like that. Or, hey, maybe it's like when you show up to church and you're getting ready to walk into the worship service, like where you sit. All of us like to hear songs that are familiar in the worship service. You know, we have certain routines and rhythms around like when we go to bed and what we do when we wake up, and we like that to be kind of have that structure to it. And so when things get out of whack or changed, some sort of wrench gets thrown into that, it throws everything off and kind of makes us go, wait a minute, how do I get my feet underneath me again? You know, so we all like that change at some level. I mean, like the status quo at some level.
Right. And I think it's kind of hard to see when this is happening, like to you. You know, we all can look in and see, hey, there's a church that, you know, had their heyday in 1985. When you go to the church, it still feels like it's the ministry model and philosophy of 1985.
Right.
You know, and it's going to happen to all churches. It's going to happen to all organizations. It's going to happen to all businesses. Mm-hmm. But I do think you can prolong that decline. You could prolong that plateau by constantly asking God, hey, make us willing to change.
Yeah.
You know, make us willing to have open hands with the stuff that's preference and not necessarily biblical.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I'm remembering when I first came on staff here and we were evaluating some of the things that were going on, you know, and we had these equip seminars that had been taking place, you know, and it was like, you know, a few times a year we would do these larger classes. and the numbers in regard to who was signing up for them and coming to it, and it started feeling like it was a heavier and heavier lift on the staff. And so I was like, I just don't know that we should be doing this anymore. It's something that's been going on for a long time, but, let's just get rid of this thing. And it's crazy. Here we are, several years later now, and I'll still have people come up to me asking, hey, are we ever going to do that, whatever it was, class again? Mm-hmm. I'm like, that's kind of over, And so it still can kind of rub people the wrong way when we change things like that.
Totally. Hit number 3.
Yeah. So number 3 is we got to let go of safety. Now, I'm not talking about here when we say we want to keep people safe. I mean, certainly when you look at like kids ministry, that kind of stuff, safety, that's right. One of those things you want to have on the forefront, So what we're not saying is throw safety out the window. But when it comes to safety around some of the decisions in regard to how risk averse we are and those kinds of things, that's what we're getting at. So when we're holding on to things just because we're afraid to risk a little bit, that's what we got to kind of toss out the window a little bit. Like here's what I'm thinking about. And this is not ministry context, but it kind of relates in to how we just think about things in our heads. A lot of times my family members will take off, like just my mom was at the beach this past weekend. She calls me and she tells me she's on her way home, and the words that came out of my mouth were, "Hey, drive safe," And I don't know that that's actually what I meant. What I desire for her life. Yeah, I want her to be safe. I don't want her to show up and like die because she had a car wreck or something like that. But what would be even better is, what if she stopped somewhere along the way and tried something she had never done before? Or what if she had some kind of experience along the journey that was just helpful to her in some kind of way? So we make it sound like safety is the number one thing, when in reality, I think when I talk to my daughter or talk to my wife, what if I was like saying, hey, what if you did something courageous today? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of the ways that I see this play out is this idea of, as the church grows, as the church has more influence, more people, more money in the bank, whatever, they begin to play kind of not to lose versus like playing to win.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to say we're trying to be safe, right? But, the spiritual word they're probably going to hide behind is we're trying to be a good steward.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And you just wonder, like, hey, how can a church, because, we've been involved in many of these situations, how can a church end up, 30, 40 years after their heyday where there's no one at the church anymore, but they have a bunch of money in the bank? Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, the church should spend all the money until there's nothing to get people at the church.
That's right.
Right? Because it's about being effective. It's about pushing back the gates of hell. Like that's, man, that's what the church is about. That's what the kingdom's about. But the more a church has, how easy is it to want to play things safe?
It's sort of a mission drift, isn't it? Where instead of a church, once they get a lot of things, whether that is they hit their heyday with people, or in terms of the resources that they have, God blesses them with all that. There can be this shift that takes place that moves from let's see what else God would have for us to let's hold on to what God has given us. So you switch from offense to defense in that kind of mentality.
Yeah, in some ways it's it's the parable of the guy giving out the different coins, and one guy goes and buries it,
Yeah.
And he thinks he's playing it safe, right. And he thinks he's doing the right thing and being a good steward, and maybe even hiding behind sort of the spiritual reasons, when in fact it's like, no, like you need to go out and risk that. Mm-hmm. For the sake of trying to multiply,
Yeah.
One of the ways this plays out, and I've even been on boards and stuff of other nonprofits, where, instead of like, okay, we're going to have a month in reserves, financial reserves for the organization, mm-hmm. right? To make sure we don't go like bankrupt or whatever. All of a sudden it's like, no, we got to have 6 months in reserves, right. for this like crazy apocalyptic thing that may happen at some point in the future. And it's almost like, people think, well, man, that's just so biblical, right? Because we're trying to be good stewards. We're trying to protect the organization or whatever. But in many ways, I'm like, I'm not sure about that. Like clearly we want to be wise, so we're not saying be unwise, but
But there's a difference in like a rainy day and a rainy decade.
Yeah, like what Pastor Andrews always said is like, man, we want to be like on the edgy side of wise.
Yeah,
like we want to be kind of pushing the envelope, because you do have to risk, to be able to grow. Like you absolutely have to open your hands and risk.
Yeah.
Like what's happened in the past, you got to bet on God doing more in the future.
Yeah, and when he says the edgy side of wise, he's not saying abandon wisdom.
No.
So it's wisdom is kind of in this spectrum, and so we want to live on that edgy side of what is still wise, not throwing it all to the wind. Let's jump on to number 4.
Yep. So number 4, something that I think people need to let go of sometimes is ministry people at times can have some weird assumptions around data. If things aren't going like you want them to go in your church, for whatever reason, in the kids ministry, in the college ministry, whatever, sometimes we can just make assumptions about like why something is happening or the reason something's happening, almost like we just assume we know the answer.
Right.
Instead of, because we're big on this at Mercy Hill, like, man, like until you actually look at some of the data of what's actually happening, you can't really know why something is going on. And I would just say, like, that's coming from a place of humility, because the bigger an organization gets, you have to recognize, especially when there's like an issue, hey, there's too many factors at play. There's too much stuff going on to know exactly why this is happening without digging into some of the data and some of the facts. You'll see ministry leaders do this where, like, there may be all this complexity and they're just like, oh, well, this is why this is happening, or this is why this is happening. And if they're wrong about that, like if they have this wrong assumption, then it's like, man, that thing is going to hold them back, right? It's going to be a limiter, because what they think is the issue is not even the issue. Like There's this thing over here that's actually the issue.
I even, sometimes it's like they're not even chasing what an issue is. Sometimes it's they have this narrative that's going on in their church, and they're so focused on that narrative that they're not looking at what's really happening with some of the metrics. For example, a couple months ago, I was talking with this church, and they were growing. I mean, it was like God was breathing on the thing, and they had more people, like way more people coming this year than they had last year. More people coming last year than they did before. So they're like on this 3-year kind of growth trajectory. And so they had been making an assumption that they would be able to count on being able to have a bigger budget for the next year as well. And then when they actually looked in at the data of what was changing, the giving in the church was basically flatlined, even though the church was growing with the amount of people that were coming in. And so they had to kind of go full stop. Hey, something's wrong here. But for a couple of years, they had been living with an assumption that their budget was growing because the amount of people were growing.
The funny thing is around data and stuff in church, man, it drives me crazy. But there's almost this assumption that, like, if you're trying to measure stuff, if you're trying to count people, whatever, it feels like anti-spiritual, which Pastor Andrew and I, we look at this like exactly the opposite of that. Like, man, if you don't know how many there are, you certainly cannot know how they are.
Yeah.
Like how they're doing as people.
You don't even know who they are.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, heaven forbid, we count money better than we do people. Right?
That's
like
right.
We need to know how many sheep there are.
Right.
Like how much money there is. Like we need to count anything that we can count. And I'm constantly pushing our staff on, like, because someone will say, well, hey, we have this issue X, Y, Z, and I'll be like, well, what's the data saying?
Right.
But a lot of churches don't actually measure anything.
Right.
Like they couldn't tell you, man, if they were 80% capacity, 90% capacity, 50% capacity.
They'll diagnose problems based on how they feel about it rather than what the numbers actually say. That's not wise.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
Like when you're smaller, sometimes you can do that just based on intuition and feel. But like as the complexity grows, you just can't do that. Like you have to know how many, you got to be able to measure stuff. And so one encouragement, one like tip would just be like to measure what you can measure. You know, like we measure anything that you can measure. First time guests, kids, first time guests, how many cars are in the parking lot, how many people are in worship, you know, how many kids are there, how much money, how many first time guests, how many second time guests.
How many volunteers are in the classroom with kids, what the ratios are, all those kinds of things.
How many people are in a community group?
Yep.
How many people that were in a group have not been to a group over the last 4 weeks? Like anything that you can measure, you should be measuring because they greatly help you make decisions
That's right.
around the future. All right, hit number 5.
Yeah, I'll call it you got to sort of get rid of the negative Nancys. Now, that's not to offend anybody whose name is Nancy. I know plenty of people whose name is Nancy.
Positive Nancy.
That are just really, really wonderful people, but you know, the alliteration thing. So, you know, there are just some people that it doesn't matter what the idea is. They're just kind of like, they're going to say that won't work. Mm-hmm. You know, they're the first ones to say everything that's wrong about the idea. They're the first ones, and they usually do it with some force, you know, where it's like, hey, we just don't think that should be happening. Don't believe in that. They're just kind of the wet blanket kind of people, you know. And so an organization just can't handle an organization that's trying to grow. So a church is trying to grow. You've got people in the room that are trying to figure out how to problem solve around those things. Somebody comes up with an idea, and before the group can even assess the idea, see what it's going to take, or any of that, it's based on feeling, yeah, that'll never work. And so those people, they're just not helpful to the situation. I'm not saying, though, that having people that look at things realistically and say, hey, this could be a problem in the future, that those people aren't helpful. They're very helpful. You want to have those kind of people in the room. I'm just talking about the people that are like the stalwarts of we're going to stand here and make it difficult to move things forward with our negativity. Mm-hmm. You got to kind of move those folks out of the way.
Yeah, a couple of things I would say around this. One, this is real. This is real. It's real in terms of this happens, but it's real in terms of this is hard to deal with. You know, it's just hard to deal with. And the couple things I would say about it, number one, the larger a church gets, you could just count on once there's more than a couple hundred people, no matter what you do, no matter what, there's somebody that's going to have an issue with it. And that will be your reality.
Yep.
Like you will never, ever, ever be able to make everybody happy. And you begin to grow over 1,000 or 2,000, like there's always, no matter what, going to be a handful of people that have an issue with it. To me, the thing that's just really hard. I mean, it's just really hard to do this because on one side, you could just be totally beat up by, you know, you have the vision, you're excited, you believe in what God's going to do, and then somebody has this negative opinion around it. It can just crush you, right? So we don't want to be like, you don't want to be on that side. What's happened to a lot of pastors on the other side of this is they've become totally hardened to any sort of negative feedback, any sort of criticism, any sort of constructive criticism.
To where they don't listen.
Yeah, instead of being overly affected by it, it's just like they're not affected. You know, it's like they got a turtle shell on. You know what I mean? Like they just like it doesn't matter what the critique is. Like man, they're just kind of going forward, and
that can be dangerous.
Yeah, and so you got to figure out how to live in the middle of that. And man, that's just a tension to be managed. You know?
Yeah. When we say get rid of them, it's not like we're saying, hey, kick them out of your church or something like that. It just means what I'm saying there is you've got to sort of mitigate how it affects you, because those people are going to always be there. But when they're speaking that, you know, how much are you listening to them? You know, what kind of access are you giving them to the decisions that are being made? How quickly are they finding out about those things? You know, there's all kinds of little decisions that you can make along the way about when the information gets to those folks to help you mitigate those kind of things.
Yeah, so as we close, you know, talking about these 5 things that we need to let go of, these 5 limiting beliefs, maybe just kind of a final takeaway about like, okay, like how do we actually apply this stuff? Like how do we actually self-diagnose? Because the issue here is the core issue with limiting beliefs. They're beliefs, which means you believe them.
Right.
So it's pretty hard to self-diagnose because it's stuff you believe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like you can't see it, right? It's like they're blind spots.
That's right.
Because you hold on to it because you actually believe it. So I don't know if you have any kind of final thoughts or takeaways of like, man, how do we do this in community? How do we kind of self-diagnose? Hey, yeah, man, that's what's holding us back. That right there.
I think what you said is the key to the whole thing, right? So you can't self-diagnose because you're not aware of it. They're blind spots. But you said, how do we do it in community? And I think the community thing is the part of it. So I think you ought to have other leaders around you that you're sharing all of this stuff with when you're processing change, when you're processing the decisions that you're thinking about making to see your church grow. And when you share those things, if you give it, when you have that kind of open community, people are going to speak those things into you. They're going to call those limiting beliefs out of you. They're going to challenge them, and it's not going to feel very good. I mean, at first it's going to be like, hey, ease up here. You're stepping on something, because when people step on beliefs, it doesn't feel good. Mm-hmm. But we have to have people step on it for us to be able to kind of start letting them go. So I think like surrounding yourself with people that you trust, that you've given permission to say hard things to you and challenge some of your beliefs around things. That's the way to go about it.
Yeah, that's great, man. Reason to lead with other kind of people on your team, people around you, and also just have other ministry leaders, even other churches
right.
that you're close with that can kind of speak in. That's great, man. Great episode.
All right.